The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, Kandahar Airfield. Control Tower Operator Staff Sergeant Martinez nearly dropped his coffee when the transmission came through, weak, distorted, but unmistakably real. Mayday, Mayday, this is Warthog 77, declaring emergency. Repeat, declaring emergency. The voice was calm, professional, but there was something else underneath. Something that made the hair on Martinez's neck stand up. Outside, the pre-dawn darkness stretched across the Afghan desert like black velvet, broken only by the distant glow of perimeter lights. The base had been quiet for 3 hours. No scheduled flights, no inbound traffic. According to every manifest, every flight log, every piece of paperwork in the system, there should be no aircraft in the air. Yet here was a pilot, calling in distress, claiming to be flying an A-10 Thunderbolt II that officially didn't exist. Warthog 77, this is Kandahar Tower, Martinez responded, his voice steady despite the confusion. State your position and nature of emergency. The reply came faster this time, cutting through the static like a knife. Tower, I'm 15 miles north of your position. Altitude Angels 8, heavy smoke in cockpit, engine running rough. Request immediate clearance for emergency landing. Martinez's hands moved across his console, pulling up radar displays, checking flight schedules, cross-referencing call signs. Nothing. The aircraft wasn't showing on radar, wasn't listed on any flight roster, and the call sign Warthog 77 had been retired for over 2 years. Negative contact on radar, Warthog 77. Confirm your tail number and squadron. The pause that followed seemed to stretch forever, filled only with the soft hiss of radio static and the distant hum of generators. When the voice came back, it carried a weight that made Martinez lean forward in his chair. Tower, this is Captain Kestrel Thorne, call sign Nighthawk. I know what you're thinking, but I'm up here, and I'm coming down whether you clear me or not. Captain Kestrel Thorne. Martinez felt his blood turn to ice. Every pilot on base knew that name, knew the legend, knew the story. The woman who'd flown more close air support missions than anyone in theater. The pilot who'd saved a surrounded Marine unit in the Korangal Valley, taking ground fire that should have killed her 10 times over. The aviator who'd been grounded 6 months ago after what the official reports called undisclosed medical circumstances, and what the rumor mill called a complete psychological breakdown. Captain Thorne, who'd sworn she'd never fly again, who'd been shipped stateside for treatment, who shouldn't be anywhere near Afghanistan, much less piloting an aircraft that didn't exist through hostile airspace at 4 in the morning. But the voice on the radio was hers, and somewhere in the darkness above the desert, an A-10 Warthog was limping home, trailing smoke and carrying secrets that would shake the foundations of everything the pilots at Kandahar thought they knew about war, loyalty, and the thin line between heroism and madness. Martinez keyed his microphone, his hand trembling slightly. The night was about to get very interesting. The first visual contact came at 3:52 hours. Senior Airman Jackson, manning the tower's observation post, spotted the aircraft through night vision goggles, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, trailing a thin plume of smoke that caught the moonlight like a ghostly banner. Tower, I've got visual on an inbound aircraft, Jackson reported, his voice tight with disbelief. Looks like an A-10 coming in from the north, smoking heavy from the starboard engine. Martinez grabbed his binoculars and stepped onto the tower's observation deck. The desert air was cold against his face, carrying the scent of dust and diesel fuel. There, silhouetted against the stars, was the distinctive twin-engine straight-wing profile of a Thunderbolt II. But this wasn't just any A-10. Even from a distance, Martinez could see the scorch marks along the fuselage, the missing panels, the way the aircraft seemed to favor its left side in flight. This was a machine that had been through hell and was barely holding together. Warthog 77, I have you in sight, Martinez transmitted. Your aircraft appears heavily damaged. Are you able to control your approach? The response crackled back immediately. Tower, I've got hydraulic pressure dropping, electrical systems intermittent, and what feels like a significant fuel leak. But I can fly this bird. Just need you to clear the runway and have the crash crew standing by." The voice belonged to Captain Kestrel Thorne, but it wasn't the broken woman who left Kandahar 6 months ago. This voice carried authority, competence, the unmistakable tone of a pilot completely in control of her aircraft despite impossible circumstances. Martinez had heard that voice before, during the dark days when Taliban forces had pushed close to the base perimeter, when Thorne's A-10 had been the thin line between American forces and disaster. Across the base, emergency protocols activated. Fire trucks roared to life, their red lights cutting through the darkness. Crash and rescue teams assembled with practiced efficiency, emergency medical personnel taking positions along the flight line. Base Commander Colonel Hayes arrived in the tower, his uniform hastily thrown over pajamas, his face grim with the realization that his quiet night had just become a potential international incident. "Martinez, what's the situation?" Hayes demanded, accepting a headset from the communications team. "Sir, we've got an unscheduled A-10 inbound, piloted by Captain Thorne, requesting emergency landing. Aircraft is heavily damaged, unknown how she got airborne or where she's been flying." Colonel Hayes studied the approaching aircraft through binoculars, his jaw tightening. "That's impossible. Thorne was medically grounded and sent stateside. She doesn't have flight authorization, and there are no A-10s missing from our inventory." But impossibility was a luxury they couldn't afford. The aircraft was real, the pilot was real, and in less than 10 minutes, both would be on the ground demanding explanations that nobody had. The approach began at 3:58 hours. Captain Thorne brought the damaged A-10 in long and shallow, compensating for reduced hydraulic pressure with textbook precision. The aircraft's landing lights cut through the darkness, illuminating a machine that looked like it had flown through a war zone. Bullet holes stitched across the wing surfaces, panels missing from the fuselage, and black smoke still trailing from the starboard engine nacelle. "Tower, Warthog 7-7 on final approach." Thorne's voice remained steady, professional. "Gear down and locked, but I'm not confident in my braking systems. Recommend crash crew deployment at the 1,000-foot markers." Martinez watched the approach through binoculars, marveling at the pilot's skill. Despite the aircraft's obvious damage, despite systems failures that would have forced most pilots to eject, Thorne was bringing the Warthog home with the kind of precision that separated competent aviators from true masters of their craft. Colonel Hayes keyed his microphone. "Captain Thorne, this is Colonel Hayes. You will taxi to the isolated hardstand upon landing and shut down your engines. Security forces will escort you for debriefing. Do you copy?" The pause was barely perceptible. "Copy, Colonel. But respectfully, sir, I think you'll want to hear what I have to say before you decide how to handle this situation." The A-10 touched down at 4:01 hours, main gear kissing the runway with barely a screech of rubber. Thorne held the aircraft straight despite obvious control difficulties, using differential braking and engine thrust to maintain directional control. The damaged Warthog rolled past the tower, past the assembled emergency crews, past the security vehicles with their flashing lights, coming to rest at the designated hardstand like a wounded bird finally finding sanctuary. As the engine spun down to silence, Colonel Hayes and his security detail approached the aircraft. The cockpit canopy remained closed, the pilot invisible behind tinted glass and the pre-dawn darkness. Emergency crews surrounded the A-10, fire suppressant systems ready, medical personnel standing by, everyone waiting for answers to questions that grew more troubling by the minute. Then the canopy began to rise. Captain Kestrel Thorne emerged slowly, removing her flight helmet to reveal close-cropped auburn hair and green eyes that had seen too much. She was thinner than Hayes remembered, marked by the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, but her movements were sure and confident as she climbed down from the cockpit. When she reached the ground and turned to face the assembled personnel, her expression was unreadable, part defiance, part relief, and something else that Colonel Hayes couldn't quite identify, something that looked suspiciously like hope. The woman who'd been declared unfit for flight duty stood on the tarmac, next to an aircraft that shouldn't exist, carrying secrets that would soon turn everything upside down. The debriefing began at 4:30 hours in Conference Room Alpha, the base's most secure briefing facility. Colonel Hayes sat across from Captain Thorne, flanked by Intelligence Officer Major Richardson and Base Security Chief Master Sergeant Cole. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Thorne's face, highlighting the exhaustion that seemed to radiate from her like heat from an engine. She'd refused medical attention, refused legal counsel, and refused to answer any questions until she'd been allowed to secure her aircraft personally. "Captain, let's start with the basics," Colonel Hayes began, his voice carefully neutral. "According to our records, you were medically grounded 6 months ago and returned to the United States for treatment. You do not have flight authorization, and you are not assigned to any unit with access to combat aircraft. Yet here you are, having flown an A-10 that doesn't appear on any inventory list. Where have you been, and where did you get that aircraft?" Thorne leaned back in her chair, studying the faces around the table. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd made peace with consequences long before this moment. "Colonel, with respect, those are the wrong questions. The right question is, what was I doing in Syrian airspace 3 days ago, and why are there American service members who officially don't exist being held in a facility that's not on any map?" The silence that followed was deafening. Major Richardson leaned forward, his expression shifting from routine interrogation to urgent attention. "Captain, are you claiming you've been conducting unauthorized operations in Syria?" Thorne's smile was grim. "Unauthorized by whom, Major? The Pentagon? Congress? The American people? Because I can guarantee you that someone with stars on their collar authorized every minute of what I've been doing for the past 6 months." Master Sergeant Cole exchanged glances with Colonel Hayes. Syrian airspace was officially off-limits to American military aircraft without specific authorization from the highest levels of command. Any unauthorized incursion could trigger an international incident, potentially dragging the United States into a broader Middle Eastern conflict. But Thorne's calm certainty suggested this was far more complex than a rogue pilot having a breakdown. "Captain, I need you to be very specific about what you're telling us," Hayes said slowly. "Are you claiming that you've been flying combat missions without the knowledge of theater command?" Thorne shook her head. "I'm claiming that I've been flying combat missions that theater command was specifically ordered not to know about. There's a difference, Colonel. A big one." She reached into her flight suit and pulled out a sealed packet, sliding it across the table. Inside that envelope is a list of names, American service members who were captured during a classified operation 8 months ago. According to official reports, those men never existed. Their families were told they died in training accidents. But they're alive, Colonel. They're alive, and they're being held in a facility run by people who aren't supposed to be our enemies, but aren't exactly our friends either. The packet sat on the table between them like a live grenade, nobody willing to touch it, but everyone understanding its potential explosive power. Colonel Hayes reached for the packet with hands that barely trembled, breaking the seal with deliberate care. As he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to concern to something approaching horror. The names on the list belonged to men from various special operations units, Rangers, Delta Force, Navy SEALs, all officially listed as killed in action during training exercises over the past year. But if Thorne was telling the truth, they were alive, imprisoned, and abandoned by a government that had decided they were too dangerous to acknowledge or too embarrassing to rescue. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered, then caught himself and looked up sharply. "Captain, if these allegations are true, and I'm not saying they are, but if they're true, you're talking about a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of the Pentagon. You're talking about war crimes, abandonment of American personnel, and international incidents that could destabilize the entire region." Thorne nodded grimly. "I'm talking about exactly that, sir. And I'm talking about why a medically grounded pilot was given an aircraft that officially doesn't exist and sent to do things that never happened. She paused, meeting Hayes' gaze directly. 6 months ago, I wasn't having a breakdown, Colonel. I was being recruited by people who knew that sometimes the only way to save American lives is to break American rules. Major Richardson had gone pale, understanding the implications faster than the others. Captain, you're describing a black operation, unsanctioned military action conducted without congressional oversight or international authorization. The kind of operation that could end careers, topple governments, and land everyone involved in federal prison for the rest of their lives. Thorne's smile was cold. Major, I'm describing the kind of operation that's been saving American lives, while politicians argue about authorization and bureaucrats worry about their careers. Those men on that list have been rotting in cells for 8 months while committees debate whether they're worth the political risk of admitting they exist. The weight of her words settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Everyone understood that they were no longer dealing with a rogue pilot or a psychological breakdown. They were dealing with something far more dangerous, a soldier who'd been asked to choose between loyalty to the system and loyalty to the people the system had abandoned. And she'd made her choice. Outside, the sun was beginning to rise over the Afghan desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. But inside Conference Room Alpha, the atmosphere remained as dark as the secrets Captain Thorne was carrying. Secrets that would soon force everyone in the room to make the same impossible choice she'd already made. The story Thorne told over the next hour would have been dismissed as fantasy if not for the evidence scattered across the conference table. Satellite photographs, communication intercepts, flight logs written in her careful handwriting, and most damning of all, a series of audio recordings that made everyone in the room accomplices to classified information they were never supposed to hear. 6 months ago, Thorne explained, she'd been approached not by enemy agents or foreign governments, but by a group within the American intelligence community that had grown frustrated with official channels and political limitations. These weren't rogue agents or conspiracy theorists. They were career military officers and intelligence professionals who'd watched American personnel disappear into bureaucratic black holes while politicians debated the political costs of acknowledgement. They called it the Nighthawk program, Thorne continued, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was revealing. Unofficial rescue operations for American service members who'd been abandoned by official channels. Small teams, off-the-books aircraft, missions that never happened conducted by people who officially weren't there. She gestured toward the damaged A-10 visible through the conference room window. That aircraft was supposed to be scrapped after taking heavy damage in a Taliban attack last year. Instead, it was rebuilt in a facility that doesn't exist, using parts that were never requisitioned, by mechanics who were never assigned to the project. Colonel Hayes struggled to process the implications. Captain, you're describing a shadow military organization operating without oversight or authorization. That's not just illegal, it's treason. Thorne's expression hardened. Is it treason to rescue American soldiers, Colonel? Is it treason to refuse to abandon people who served their country with honor? Because I can tell you what feels like treason. It's listening to politicians explain why those men are acceptable losses, while their families bury empty coffins. Major Richardson had been studying the audio recordings, his face growing more troubled with each passing minute. Captain, these recordings. They're conversations between high-ranking Pentagon officials discussing the decision to declare these men killed in action. They knew the soldiers were alive. They knew where they were being held, and they decided that a rescue operation was politically unacceptable. The weight of that revelation settled over the room like a physical presence, making the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Master Sergeant Cole, who'd remained silent throughout the briefing, finally spoke up. Ma'am, what you're describing sounds like the kind of thing that happens in movies, not in the real military. Shadow organizations, black ops rescues, government conspiracies. It's hard to believe. Thorne's laugh was bitter. Sergeant, 3 days ago I flew that into Syrian airspace, engaged Syrian air defense systems, and extracted 2 American prisoners from a facility that officially doesn't exist. Right now, those men are in a safe house in Turkey, receiving medical treatment for injuries they sustained while being tortured by people our government claims are allies. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night. The room fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sounds of normal base operations, aircraft engines, vehicle traffic, the routine sounds of military life continuing obliviously outside, while everything familiar crumbled inside Conference Room Alpha. Colonel Hayes looked at the evidence scattered before him, understanding that his next decision would define the rest of his career and possibly his life. The safe choice was clear. Arrest Captain Thorne, confiscate the evidence, report the incident through official channels, and let higher authorities deal with the consequences. But the right choice was something else entirely, something that would require him to join Thorne in the gray area between loyalty to the system and loyalty to the people the system had failed. The photographs Thorne produced next removed any remaining doubt about the reality of her claims. High-resolution images showing American personnel in prison uniforms, clearly identifiable despite months of captivity and obvious mistreatment. The faces were gaunt, marked by exhaustion and pain, but unmistakably the men listed in the classified documents. Master Sergeant David Kowalski, Army Rangers. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Washington, Navy SEALs. Staff Sergeant Timothy Chen, Air Force Special Operations. Men who'd been declared dead, mourned by their families, honored in memorial services, while spending 8 months in cells that weren't supposed to exist. These were taken 4 days ago, Thorne explained, her voice growing softer as she spoke about the men she'd risked everything to save. The facility is operated by a Syrian government faction that officially doesn't exist, funded by money that officially was never appropriated, housing prisoners who officially were never captured. It's the perfect black hole. Nobody has to take responsibility because nobody officially knows it exists. Major Richardson studied the photographs with the trained eye of an intelligence officer, noting details that confirmed their authenticity, shadows consistent with the reported geographic location, architectural features matching known Syrian construction techniques, even the specific type of prison uniforms used in that region. Captain, assuming these images are genuine, how did you locate this facility? Intelligence gathering of this quality requires resources far beyond what a single pilot could access. Thorne's smile was grim. Major, I told you, I wasn't working alone. The Nighthawk program has been developing intelligence on abandoned American personnel for over 2 years. They have assets in places that would surprise you, people who have grown tired of watching American soldiers disappear into bureaucratic convenience. She pulled out another packet, this one thicker than the first. This contains intelligence reports on 17 different facilities across 6 countries where American service members are being held. Some are prisoners of war who were never officially captured. Others are special operations personnel whose missions were disavowed after they went wrong. All of them are Americans who served their country with honor and were abandoned when acknowledging them became politically inconvenient. The scope of what Thorne was describing staggered everyone in the room. This wasn't just about one rescue mission or one group of abandoned soldiers. It was about a systematic pattern of abandonment that reached the highest levels of the American military and intelligence establishment. Colonel Hayes felt the weight of command in a way he'd never experienced before, understanding that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would echo far beyond Kandahar airfield. Captain, he said slowly, choosing his words with extreme care, what you're describing amounts to a complete breakdown of the chain of command. You're alleging that senior military leadership has systematically abandoned American personnel for political reasons, and that a shadow organization has formed to conduct unauthorized rescue operations. The implications are, he trailed off, struggling to find words adequate to the situation. The implications are that American soldiers can't trust their government to bring them home, Thorne finished for him. The implications are that sometimes the only way to honor the promise we make to leave no one behind is to break the rules made by people who never had to make that promise themselves. The truth of her words hung in the air like smoke from her damaged aircraft, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to easily dismiss. The turning point came when Master Sergeant Cole, who'd been skeptical throughout the briefing, asked the question that changed everything. "Captain, you mentioned extracting 2 prisoners 3 days ago. Where are the others? According to your documents, there were at least 8 Americans being held at that facility." Thorne's expression shifted, revealing the first crack in her composed demeanor. "Sergeant, we could only extract 2. The aircraft was damaged during the escape and we had to make choices. The other 6 are still there, still alive, still waiting for someone to remember that they exist." The weight of that admission filled the room with a silence so profound that everyone could hear their own heartbeats. 6 American service members remained imprisoned, abandoned by their government, dependent on the actions of people in a conference room at Kandahar Airfield to determine whether they would ever see freedom again. Colonel Hayes understood that this was the moment when abstract discussions of policy and authorization became personal, became real, became urgent. "Captain, are you asking us to join this Nighthawk program?" he asked directly, cutting through the diplomatic language and bureaucratic hedging. Thorne met his gaze steadily. "Colonel, I'm telling you that there are American soldiers who need to be rescued, and official channels have already failed them. What you do with that information is your decision, but I can tell you that those men don't have time for congressional hearings or Pentagon investigations. Every day they spend in that facility is another day of torture, another day of wondering if their country has forgotten they exist." Major Richardson had been studying the intelligence reports, correlating information with his own classified knowledge of regional operations. "Captain, some of these facilities, I recognize the locations. They're connected to operations that were classified beyond my clearance level. This isn't just about abandoned personnel. It's about missions that went wrong, operations that were disavowed, entire units that were sacrificed for political expedience." His voice grew quiet as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This goes all the way to the top. Joint Chiefs, Secretary of Defense, possibly even the White House." The realization that they were discussing potential treason at the highest levels of government sobered everyone. This wasn't just about military discipline or following orders. It was about fundamental questions of loyalty, honor, and the price of doing what's right in a system that had forgotten what right meant. Outside the conference room, normal military life continued, but inside, 4 people wrestled with decisions that would define their careers, their consciences, and possibly their lives. Colonel Hayes looked at each person in the room, understanding that whatever happened next would bind them together in ways that no regulation or manual could address. They were no longer just military personnel following orders. They were Americans faced with an impossible choice between loyalty to the system and loyalty to the people the system had abandoned. The decision came not through lengthy debate or careful analysis, but through a moment of clarity that sometimes arrives when all alternatives have been exhausted. Colonel Hayes stood up slowly, walked to the conference room window, and stared out at the damaged A-10 sitting on the hardstand, a machine that had been declared dead but had somehow found a way to fly again, piloted by a woman who'd been declared unfit but had somehow found the strength to save lives that officially didn't exist. "30 years I've been in this uniform," he said quietly, not turning away from the window. 30 years of following orders, respecting the chain of command, believing that the system works even when I couldn't see how. I've buried friends who died following orders they believed in, and I've watched politicians explain why their sacrifices were necessary for the greater good." He turned back to face the room. "But I've never been asked to abandon Americans who were still alive, still fighting, still hoping that someone would remember the promise we made to bring them home." The transformation was visible in his posture, his expression, the way he carried himself. This wasn't the base commander who'd entered the room 3 hours earlier. This was a soldier who'd rediscovered why he joined the military in the first place. Captain Thorne, I need you to understand something. If we do this, if we commit to this course of action, there's no going back. We're talking about direct violation of orders from the highest levels of command. We're talking about potential courts-martial, federal prison, the end of everything we've worked for. Are you certain, absolutely certain, that these men are worth that risk? Thorne's response came without hesitation. Colonel, I've already risked everything for them. The question is whether you're willing to do the same. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who'd already counted the cost and found it acceptable. Those men didn't ask to be abandoned. They didn't ask to become politically inconvenient. They asked to serve their country, and their country asked them to trust that they wouldn't be forgotten. Someone needs to keep that promise. Major Richardson cleared his throat, drawing attention to the implications everyone was dancing around. Sir, if we commit to this, we're not just risking our careers, we're risking the security and stability of this entire base. Once we cross this line, we become part of an organization that operates outside legal authority. Every person on this base becomes potentially complicit in actions that could be classified as treason. The weight of that statement settled over the room, making everyone conscious of the magnitude of the decision before them. But Master Sergeant Cole, who'd been the most skeptical voice in the room, spoke up with unexpected resolution. Major, with respect, this base has been part of a war that's lasted 20 years, where we've asked soldiers to fight and die for objectives that keep changing, against enemies who blend into the civilian population, in support of a government that can't decide what victory looks like. If we're going to risk everything, at least this time it's for something clear, bringing American soldiers home. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the sergeant's words, understanding that they'd reached the point of no return. Whatever decision they made in the next few minutes would define not just their individual futures, but the fate of 6 Americans whose only hope lay in a damaged A-10 and the people brave enough to fly into the darkness to bring them home. Colonel Hayes returned to his seat, his decision already made but requiring the formal acknowledgement that would make it real. Captain, I need operational details. How many aircraft would we need? What kind of support? What's the timeline for extraction? The questions were practical, focused, the kind that military professionals ask when they've moved past whether to act and started planning how to act successfully. Thorne pulled out detailed tactical plans that she'd obviously prepared long before this conversation. Maps, flight routes, communication protocols, contingency plans for various scenarios, the kind of comprehensive operational planning that required weeks of preparation and intimate knowledge of the target facility. The extraction will require 2 aircraft, she began, spreading the materials across the conference table. Primary will be another A-10 for close air support and suppression of enemy air defenses. Secondary will be a helicopter for personnel extraction, ideally a Black Hawk with extended range modifications. Major Richardson studied the flight plans with a professional eye, nodding the careful attention to radar coverage, surface-to-air missile sites, and civilian aircraft routes that would provide cover during the ingress and egress phases. Captain, this is extremely sophisticated planning, the kind that requires real-time intelligence, weather data, and coordination with multiple agencies. How do you propose to accomplish this without alerting Theater Command or triggering international incident protocols? The answer revealed the true scope of the Nighthawk program's capabilities. Major, we've been planning this operation for 3 months. We have assets providing real-time intelligence, weather monitoring, and communication support. The extraction is scheduled to coincide with a routine NATO training exercise in the region, providing cover for unusual aircraft movements. Syrian air defense systems will experience technical difficulties at precisely the moment our aircraft enter their airspace. Thorne's matter-of-fact delivery made extraordinary claims sound routine, but everyone in the room understood the level of coordination and resources required to make such an operation possible. Master Sergeant Cole raised the question that had been troubling him since the beginning. "Ma'am, if this Nighthawk program has all these resources and capabilities, why do they need us? Why involve personnel from Kandahar when they obviously have their own people and equipment?" It was a shrewd observation, cutting to the heart of operational security concerns that should have occurred to everyone earlier. Thorne's smile was grim. "Sergeant, because after 3 days of flying combat missions in a damaged aircraft, fighting my way through Syrian air defenses, and conducting extraction operations under hostile fire, this A-10 is finished. The airframe is compromised, the engines are beyond field repair, and the avionics are held together with determination and prayers." She gestured toward the window where the smoking aircraft sat like a monument to impossible odds. "We need a fresh aircraft, a fresh pilot, and a fresh set of people willing to risk everything for Americans who have already given everything." The room absorbed this information with the understanding that they weren't just being recruited. They were being asked to inherit a mission from someone who'd already paid the price for attempting it. Colonel Hayes felt the weight of command settling on his shoulders in a way that no training exercise or academic preparation had ever anticipated. Understanding that he was being asked to authorize an operation that violated every principle of military discipline, while simultaneously embodying the deepest values of military service. The final piece of the operational puzzle came when Thorne produced a tablet computer containing encrypted video messages from the 2 Americans she'd already extracted. The faces that appeared on the screen were gaunt, marked by months of captivity, but unmistakably alive and unquestionably American. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez spoke first, his voice weak but determined. "If anyone is watching this, if anyone still cares, please don't forget the others. They're still there, still fighting, still believing that America doesn't abandon its own." The second message came from Petty Officer Williams, whose injuries were more severe but whose message was equally clear. "6 months ago, I thought we were dead to the world. Captain Thorne showed us that someone still remembers what honor means. Please, bring the others home." The emotional impact of hearing from men who'd been officially declared dead was overwhelming. These weren't abstract policy decisions or bureaucratic calculations. These were American service members appealing directly to their fellow soldiers for help that official channels had denied. Major Richardson wiped his eyes without shame, understanding that they'd moved far beyond questions of regulation or authorization into territory where only conscience could provide guidance. Colonel Hayes made the decision that would define the rest of his life with characteristic military directness. "Captain, what do you need from us?" The question was simple, but its implications were revolutionary. With 6 words, he'd committed Kandahar Airfield to supporting an operation that violated military law, international treaties, and direct orders from higher command. But he'd also committed to honoring promises that the military had made to every soldier who'd ever worn the uniform, promises that had been forgotten by everyone, except the people willing to risk everything to keep them. Thorne's response was equally direct. "I need an A-10 pilot qualified for combat operations, ground support personnel who can maintain operational security, and a command structure willing to provide cover for aircraft and personnel that officially aren't conducting operations that officially aren't happening." She paused, meeting each person's gaze in turn. "And I need all of that ready to deploy in 72 hours, because intelligence indicates that the remaining prisoners are going to be moved to a facility we can't reach if we don't act immediately." The timeline was impossibly short for an operation of this complexity, but everyone in the room understood that impossible timelines were part of military life. The difference was that this time, they were operating without the support structure and resources that usually made impossible things possible. They would be relying on determination, improvisation, and the kind of professional competence that separated elite military units from ordinary soldiers. Master Sergeant Cole asked the practical question that would determine whether the operation was feasible. "Ma'am, you mentioned needing an A-10 pilot. Who did you have in mind?" The answer surprised everyone, including Thorne herself, who realized as she spoke that she'd already made a decision she hadn't consciously acknowledged. "I'm going back," she said simply. "This is my mission, my responsibility, my promise to keep. I brought 2 men home, and I'm going to bring the rest home too." Colonel Hayes started to object, pointing out her obvious exhaustion and the medical concerns that had originally grounded her, but Thorne cut him off with a gesture. "Colonel, with respect, I'm the only pilot in this room who's flown this specific mission profile, who knows the target facility, who has established communication with the prisoners. More importantly, I'm the only one who's already paid the personal cost of defying orders for the right reasons." The truth of her words was undeniable, but so were the practical concerns about sending an already exhausted pilot back into combat in an aircraft that would be pushed to its operational limits. Major Richardson voiced what everyone was thinking. "Captain, you've been flying combat operations for 3 days with minimal rest, maximum stress, and now you're proposing to do it again in 72 hours. The human factors alone make this extremely dangerous, and if something happens to you during the mission, those 6 men will never be rescued." Thorne's response revealed the depth of her commitment and the personal cost of the choices she'd already made. "Major, 6 months ago I was grounded because a military psychologist decided that I cared too much about keeping promises to dead soldiers. 3 days ago, I proved that those soldiers weren't dead, and that some promises are worth keeping regardless of the cost." Her voice grew quiet, but her determination was absolute. "Those men have been waiting 8 months for someone to remember they exist. They're not waiting any longer." The decision was made not through formal votes or command authorization, but through the kind of unspoken understanding that develops between people who have shared dangerous truths and chosen dangerous loyalties. Colonel Hayes would provide official cover and logistical support. Major Richardson would handle intelligence coordination and communication security. Master Sergeant Cole would oversee aircraft maintenance and operational security. And Captain Kestrel Thorne would fly one more mission into hostile territory to keep a promise that her government had forgotten how to make.